Hello everyone, can everyone hear me all right? Yeah, is it coming through loud and clear? Amazing. Well, thank you for coming to our talk. I was going to say this afternoon, it's still morning. We are from Manifesto, and so we're going to talk to you about a low carbon approach to digital in the, I guess, the current sort of ecosystem and the landscape, and thinking about the impact that we're having on the environment. We're going to talk a lot about the sort of digital carbon footprint, which gets maybe a bit less attention than the sort of physical counterpart, but is constantly growing and becoming more impactful. And I guess really want to make sure we share that, sort of educate you all about that, and talk a little bit about what can we do to maybe start to turn the tide and think about the impact we're having and how we can meet our environmental goals. So a quick introduction to ourselves. So I'm Paul, I'm the Business Design Director at Manifesto, so I look after our strategy department, where we think about everything from sort of like digital strategy and transformation through to sort of like product strategy and services. And so for us, thinking about sustainability and the sort of long-term impacts of the things that we're building is a big part of our goal. And with me, I've got Ant.
Hello everyone, I'm Ant, I'm a strategist, and it's my role to help connect digital challenges to the bigger organisation vision and goals, mission, etc. And so as part of this work on Paul's team is helping people like yourselves understand how to act in this space and make the case to other stakeholders inside the organisation.
And just a bit of background for Manifesto. So we are a sort of digital experience agency for change makers. And what we mean by that is we want to work with purpose-driven organizations. So we work a lot in the sort of not-for-profit space, in sort of like higher education, in public sector, really working with organizations that we would say are looking to do good in the world. And so that's the people that we want to work with and what we champion. I should also point out the QR code, because our marketing manager made me put it on most of the slides throughout this. So please do scan it and have a look at it. And I've done my marketing bit and tick that box. Just a quick headline of who we work with. So charity and fundraising, public sector, sort of memberships and visit, and then we do work a lot in the sort of education space as well. So we've worked with University of Dundee, University of Edinburgh, Kingston University, I think Leeds University as well. We've also worked with people like the Holocaust Education Trust, and so there's a lot of work that we do around the sort of education space, from different digital products through to LMSs, through to different integrations, etc. And just a little bit, and this is the last bit about us before we'll get into the detail in terms of like some of the impact that we've driven. So with the Brunel University, we were able to sort of reduce their sort of helpline inquiries whilst raising the number of applications coming through in terms of optimizing their journeys and their experience. With UNICEF, we've helped double their donations year on year. We've also helped to drive booking conversions up with our work with the National Trust. And most relevant to this talk, we've also helped the Climate Group reduce their digital estate by sort of 80% in terms of carbon emissions. And the Climate Group and the work that we did with them was really our first foray a number of years ago into sort of building in a low carbon, sustainable way. And some of the learnings and some of the experience from that is what's sort of driven this talk and is what we will share with you today. Over to Ant to tell us why it's important.
Thank you. So why should we care about decarbonising our digital estate? Well, we don't need to dwell on the scientific case too much because we should all know this by now. I'm confident everyone in the room knows this by now. We're putting far more carbon into the atmosphere than we are taking out. And the kind of uncomfortable truth is that net zero probably doesn't go far enough. We need to be carbon negative in some of our industries, and digital is no exception to this. In fact, the scale of digital carbon emissions is huge, and some estimates place it as high as 4%, which would be more than the aviation industry. And we think about the focus on aviation in terms of decarbonisation and its negative impact on the climate compared to digital. Well, digital is probably getting away pretty lightly right now, and we'll talk about what some of the major drivers of digital carbon emissions are in a sec. And the challenge on our hands in the sector is the global energy use from digital is projected to grow to around 25% by 2050, and our emerging technologies like artificial intelligence in particular, and also the kind of rise of video, kind of high quality streaming, video calls, etc., means we're placing a lot more demands on data centers, and those data centers require a lot of energy to power and a lot of water to cool the chips in artificial intelligence solutions. So we've got a problem already, and the problem is going to get worse. So it's really incumbent on the sector to have an awakening to this problem and then understand how to take practical action to have a more positive impact on the planet?
So what I'm going to do is just highlight from the work that we've been doing with a number of different organizations what some of the biggest sort of decarbonisation challenges are that we're seeing for the digital industry. The first one that I want to talk about is about website traffic and hosting. So our population is increasing, our use of the internet is increasing, so the amount of traffic that we are seeing is also increasing. In the last 7 years, we've seen a 600% rise in internet traffic, which means more people are using content, more people are using data, more people are creating content and data, more people are storing content and data. And I guess the increase in sort of population in itself isn't so much of a bad thing, but what I want everyone to sort of take away and think about is actually in terms of the traffic that we're seeing on the internet, about 50% of that is actually down to bad bots. And that is something that we can do something about. And so that's something that we can help control in terms of reducing the number of bots that are sort of like visiting your site, thinking about all the tracking and the sort of like marketing stuff that you put on your website, ranging from analytics through to sort of Hotjar, through to all the rest of it. This is something that we can control and look to reduce in terms of like the impact that that's having. It's also a performance factor as well in terms of how it can speed up your estate. Data and digital management is the other big one. So data center workloads, they've risen by over 340% since 2015. Google and Microsoft themselves have also highlighting that actually these data center sort of carbon emissions are really impacting people's ability to meet their net zero targets. Ant's already sort of mentioned AI in terms of what that's doing. That's only going to be increasing that data center usage, and so that's a big problem that we want to get around. And there's a really interesting sort of anecdote I'll touch on, which happened in sort of a London council recently, where there was an old sort of like airstrip that they wanted to sort of, it was from Epping Forest, so they'd basically taken away part of the forest, put in an airstrip. That airstrip was no longer being used. Rather than give that airstrip back to the land and sort of like reforest it, actually what they did is they sold it to Google, and it's now a massive data center, which is a little bit of out of the frying pan into the fire in terms of what we're doing in that space. And then lastly, artificial intelligence. So everyone's sort of aware of it. There's been a lot of talks, I think, already in the conference around AI. Hopefully people are already aware that, like, you know, in terms of it being in our search now, in terms of like using ChatGPT, every time you're using it, that uses a lot more water in order to make sure we're cooling the servers and generating that electricity. So even every single search that we're doing now on Google is using more and more energy as part of it. And estimates have been sort of put out in some studies that in 2025, AI is going to be responsible for using 6.6 cubic meters of water. To put that into context, that's about half of the UK's annual water usage. And so that's the impact that AI is going to be potentially having in terms of our landscape. And that's probably only going to be increasing as more AI tools and features and products come out. So that's the sort of landscape. That's the sort of like big scary bit in terms of the reality. But what can we do to help? What's the positive? What's the sort of flip side of this? And what can we do to try and turn the tide in terms of that emission? So we do a lot of work with the Green Software Foundation. Hopefully some of you have heard of them and are aware of them. They're really, really good. Would definitely recommend going and having a look at their site. They put out a lot of content about how to sort of build more sustainable products and services in the sort of digital space. And they talk about a number of different areas that we can focus on in terms of improving. So they describe it as energy efficiency. This is really talking about, I guess, the software and how the software that we're producing can consume less electricity and perform its functions. Hardware, so this is about actually what's the physical resources needed in order to perform these functions. Think about the sort of landscape of like people having to use new phones being required to house all that sort of new software, that sort of thing. And then we've got carbon awareness. Carbon awareness is a really interesting one that we'll talk to as we go through this. This is about really understanding like the state of the energy in the grid. So there are times where energy within the grid is greener and more sustainable, and how we can actually capitalize on that and use that is a really interesting space. And then the last one is one that we've added and part of why we're here today, and it's really about informing and educating. I think a big problem is, again, like I kind of mentioned at the start, people think that digital perhaps doesn't have carbon impact, and actually that's really not true, and more and more is becoming a bigger challenge. So just to run through a few headlines of some of the things that you can start to think about. So energy efficiency, a lot of these were taken from that climate group build that we sort of mentioned. So think about some of the things that are going to help reduce the emission as part of your build. Think about your use of image and video. That should hopefully be quite an obvious one in terms of where you're loading it, the sort of resolution that you're putting up at. Also, in terms of videos, when you're hosting them on your site, like in terms of autoplay and stuff like this, that actually can have quite a big impact in terms of your emission and your efficiency. Make sure you're sort of like really looking to prevent those bad bots, which I mentioned. Make sure you're really using caching and CDNs to manage that traffic as well. And make sure you're thinking about your data capture. So data is one that I'll talk about a little bit as we go through this, but it's a real problem in terms of the amount of redundant and outdated data that people are storing in spaces. And so make sure you're thinking about what data you're capturing, why you need it, and also thinking about what's that sort of life cycle of the data in terms of once you've captured it and you don't need it anymore, have you got techniques in place that allow you to archive it or delete it if you're not going to be using it, which ties me nicely into the sort of hardware efficiency. And that's really the big aspect here when we talk about the hardware side of things. We want to make sure that we are not adding to the 60 million tons of e-waste that is produced per year. So when you're thinking about content and data, have workflows in place that allow you to archive things and look to really reduce the amount of storage that you have. There are techniques to do that we're not going to talk about in this talk, but if you come to our stand, we can talk a bit more about. There are things like your digital asset management tools and stuff which can help really get ahead of that as well. And the other thing I will say on the hardware side is there are cost benefits to doing that as well. If you're storing less, if you're housing less, actually your hosting should get cheaper as a result of it. And then the really nice and interesting one, which is the carbon awareness. So this is where we're starting to look at how we can use greener energy in the grid. And there's a really nice example here, Branch, and we'll share these slides and people can go and see the sort of link. But what they do, which is really nice on their site, is depending on where the energy is in the grid, if it's really green, they'll house their high resolution visual sort of video media rich page content. Whereas actually, if they have the energy in the grid being sort of like dirtier or less sustainable, it'll strip that back and it'll just present the sort of like more flat HTML version. And that's making sure that basically it's using less energy at that point. And it's a really nice example of how you can use the grid. In terms of like Microsoft and Apple, you can actually set it on your phones and your laptops now to say that you do your updates when energy in the grid is greener. And so there's some really interesting opportunities when we talk about like digital products and services about how we use that technology. And that's something that we're looking at quite a lot at the moment. The last thing I'll mention in terms of the inform and educate, and a big thing that we'll talk about here is really thinking about low carbon as part of your digital data and technology strategies as well. Make sure it's in there. It's becoming more and more of a thing in terms of like people looking for this, and you will get measured on it, and it will come into sort of like standards and expectations. So the sooner you start thinking about that as part of your strategy, the better you'll be in terms of positioning yourself. And then I'll hand to Ant to talk about our sustainability audit.
Thank you. So there was a lot in that, and obviously there is a lot that occupies you and your roles and your teams. So it can be hard to know where to start and where the big hitters are in terms of reductions. So we've got a sustainability audit that has 3 stages where essentially we measure, then evaluate, benchmark against your kind of best practice in the sector, overall global warming potential. We'll make recommendations and size the improvement projects required to decarbonize your estate. And then obviously we talk it through with you, make sure you understand what that action involves and what the carbon reduction will look like when you implement. And then in terms of the implementation, we can hand off projects to you or be a capacity build in the team to actually make those recommendations happen. We've got a case study here, so go to the next slide. I'll go to case study in a bit, just go into these in a little bit more detail. So in terms of some of those big areas of measurements, we've got a kind of best practice website checklist. We check the data flows and transfers across your architecture, assess web traffic, servers, cloud hosting, and then your content governance as well. As Paul mentioned, often this is a space where we can make a lot of reductions, a lot of redundant content, a lot of opportunities for making that content more efficient and cleaner as well. And we've used global warming potential as the main metric in this audit, and this is from the Boa Vista Foundation. And so we'll rate each measure that you can take with this grid here, which shows you kind of where the big hitters are in terms of climate friendliness. And then in terms of evaluation, this is the main output from the audit. It's a very detailed report, which acts as a bit of a manual for decarbonising your estate, though it's also a kind of proof of concept that your teams can act in this space, and we found it can be helpful with socialising the work that you've done, your commitment to being part of your university's climate commitments. And in the report, we set out area by area what percentage of global warming reduction is possible, what it means for the reduction in your energy usage, and the reduction in overall carbon emissions as well. And every report will have this headline total impact score, when you can see how much global warming potential you can reduce by implementing the recommendations in the report. And in terms of that implementation, so we'll size and help you add those projects to your backlog. We can be that capacity build for leading implementation, and then importantly, socializing the work. Obviously, the kind of digital ways of working will extend far beyond your team, and this is a real opportunity to kind of be role model inside the university, inside the sector by acting on this, and kind of case making for digital decarbonisation and raising awareness of the negative impacts of poor practice when it comes to digital estates. And generally, we find there are some big hitters. So here's some useful takeaways in terms of action areas. So obviously, aiming for less than 2 megabytes per page. Obviously, that can be a particular challenge for universities. You know, got those kind of glossy campus images, and trying to bring to life that student experience can be a challenge, but it can be done. We've worked with universities, and recently the University of Dundee on this. And obviously your plugins, your third-party web tools and services, the amount of scripts that you have running on the page, and then, of course, optimized images and videos. In terms of your hosting optimization, reducing the server usage and minimizing your storage and data footprint's important. And then in terms of your caching, your optimization, CDNs, shifting to that type of delivery is really, really important as well. So this is the impact that we were able to have with University of Dundee when we went through each of those stages of measurement, evaluation, and implementation. We were able to have a potential reduction in global warming potential by at least 55%. So sizable impact there, and it basically enabled the university digital team to act as a role model inside the university, showed that they could be part of sustainable solutions, and hopefully by showing their work here, demonstrate the changes possible inside the sector and inside teams similar to yours. Back to Paul.
Amazing. It's probably worth saying as well, when we come to hosting, so we've got a stand with our sort of Acquia partners. They have got their sort of product Acquia Cloud next. Come and have a chat to us about that, because that was a big factor in being able to reduce some of that hosting emission, and that's something that depending on your hosting provider can be easier or harder depending on how much they want to play ball, because they may not want to give you some of that data, is what we found, because it can be quite damning at places. I guess some of the headlines, though, of what we want you to take away from this. I guess sustainability can't be thought of in a silo or a vacuum. So really, when we approach sort of digital products, what we want to do is think about low carbon as part of our non-functional requirements. So in the same way that you would think about accessibility, you'd think about security, you'd think about performance, we want you to think about sustainability as well. Make sure it's part of those requirements and part of that sort of acceptance criteria for your build. When we're producing our sort of like JIRA tickets and everything like that now, it's part of our criteria. So within that, like meeting sort of AA or AAA standards, we will say actually these are the sustainability standards that we want to hit. There are guidelines out there now that you can use. We've actually worked with W3C on some of their guidelines, and we can share the link round to where you can access that, so that can all feed into your services and your build. And I guess lastly then, some of the key takeaways that we want to share. So I think the really important thing is like every team has a role to play in protecting the planet, and this is digital included. We work with a lot of organizations, like we mentioned, like memberships and visits, an example. People like Kew Gardens or National Trust, where they've got some really, really big sort of like physical demands. Talk about like the sort of like greenhouses they've got, and sort of like big physical estates that they're managing, where like there is big environmental impact. But actually digital is as much a role to play that as they do, especially again in the sort of like the growing area of where we're looking at using more and more software solutions to meet sort of our needs. Make sure you're committing to decarbonising your digital estate. By doing this, you'll make sure you're really outlining a role for your team in meeting your organisation's climate goals. It will also help to position you as a bit of a climate leader in the sector. It's something that you can then talk about and sort of promote. I think in terms of thinking about audiences as well, this is something that we know from our audience research that more and more audiences are looking for. People want to see that you are conscious of your environmental impact and that you're doing something positive about it. And then make sure you socialize the work, because we can create this sort of ripple effect of change. A lot of people are still in that learning space of realizing the impact that digital actually has on the environment. And so we want to lead by example. We want to make sure people are aware of what this is, aware of these own sort of like unseen emissions, especially thinking about sort of like AI and how you use it. And so make sure you're thinking about this, driving it forward. And I think together, the more of us that are sort of on this same page and sort of championing this message, the bigger the difference that we can make. The more estates that we've got doing this, the more universities or institutes that are on board, the greater the impact we can have on making sure we're keeping our emissions low. And that is our last slide, hopefully just in time. I did see the 10-minute go up.
3 minutes. So
There we go.
we've got 8 minutes for questions.
So 8 minutes questions, thank you very much. I've done it for them. Any questions from anyone? Yes, go for it.
Very quick question. So you talked about sustainability and low carbon footprint being roughly part of the technology strategy. So I'm sure you did it with a couple of people when you did the technology strategy and were saying, how did it go? Because it's all the focus is on doing more AI, more transmission, more digital. How did you balance it out?
It's a really good question. So I'll repeat that just in case people don't hear it in terms of like embedding sustainability into the tech strategy. How did it go, especially when thinking about like new tools, AI, and all of this that we need to be pushing forward? And the answer to that is, I guess, a lot of the language when we're talking about some of the sustainability stuff as part of the tech strategy, we tie it into a lot of the sort of performance and like cost saving benefits of doing it. So a lot of the sustainability best practice does like align with performance best practice and sort of reducing cost and sort of reducing overhead. And so that's the line that we would usually take in terms of selling it to like a senior audience or to like an external audience. Like ultimately bottom line does matter, and so that's the sort of language that we would use to sort of pitch it and make sure we were able to put it in there. There's a slide that we didn't show in terms of like new tooling and technology about sort of like managing your AI culture. So this is another thing that we sort of talk about. And so when we reference that, what we mention in these strategies is make sure you've got an AI policy, for example. Make sure within that policy you're talking about the sort of checkbox items that if you're going to adopt AI, it needs to meet. And so that will typically, most people will be focused on like the security aspect and risk around AI, but also like make sure there's a sustainability lens to some of that, so you can assess these products or these tools, make sure actually they're doing what they can in terms of the hosting solution around, like even if it's slightly greenwashing, where they do in places, there's a lot of that, that's still better than nothing at all. So have some of these checks where you can go, okay, if we're going to adopt this tool, we're making sure we're doing some due diligence that they are doing what they can for green hosting solutions. And then as part of that, and this is another thing that we champion, when you're going out to these sort of partners to sort of engage them, challenge them on that, like ask them that question, make sure that they have a sort of respectable answer is a big part of sort of the strategy and sort of rolling it out. Does that make sense?
And just to come in on the AI piece as well, yeah, it's going to be very hard to resist the kind of momentum around AI adoption. We are seeing positive action in the space in terms of calculating the carbon impact of AI usage. Salesforce and Hugging Face have a league table now of the kind of cleanest and dirtiest AI providers. That's a really, really positive step to help organizations understand what platform to choose or what on-platform tools to use. But it's really clear the platforms need to be doing a lot more around raising the visibility of the carbon-intensive nature of the solutions. And we think universities can be part of that solution. So building credibility in this space, helping your environmental science faculties make their pages super sustainable, helping with that socialization piece can be part of shaping future leaders who can lobby these organizations to be more responsible. Thank you. And a question over here.
Yeah, my question was, there were three segments that you had in one of the earlier slides. One was tending to focus on software, one tended to focus on hardware, and the other one was sort of another area around data. Do you find there's a rough sort of split between those where the impact, does it centre around one of those more than the others?
Yes, that's a really good question. Again, I'll repeat it just so everyone heard it. It was in terms of the areas that we were looking at, which was like energy efficiency, hardware efficiency, and one which was about like using the energy on the grid and where's the sort of biggest area. I think for us, typically being a software agency, that's probably the biggest area that we've spent a lot of time focusing in terms of like that software reduction and what we can do. And that does have quite a big impact on the hardware as well. If you're producing more lean and efficient software, you don't need the next sort of like expensive set of hardware each time to manage it. And so personally, I think where we've looked at it, it's been a lot more on the software side of it, where we've seen a lot more of the bigger areas. The sort of grid part of it is something that's relatively newer. And so we've not had a chance, I don't think, to fully explore the potential of that. I mentioned like the Apple and Microsoft updates using the grid at a sensible time. One thing we've not done, but it's on our sort of list to really explore, is like, how can we apply that to our sort of like service journeys and sort of digital products in a really meaningful and effective way that doesn't compromise those journeys and those conversions and all the sort of like underlying numbers that we want to reach. So yeah, I think software, I don't know if there's anything on your side to add.
Well, it might be helpful to add that in terms of actions that we can take on software, it doesn't have to be all or nothing as well. So to use the grid example, that really lovely example that we had up where those videos and images don't display when the grid is powered by dirty energy, that's probably not going to be that practical for universities. So could it be a health warning on some videos or a little, notification, etc., when you're about to play a video or go on a virtual tour, etc.? It doesn't have to be all or nothing.
And it's probably worth saying as well, I don't know, like a lot of you will be sort of probably either like Drupal, perhaps in terms of your content management system, or Umbraco. There are sustainability sort of like content modules that are coming out. So we built one for Umbraco, which is for content editors. So when they're actually producing the page, it'll tell you the weight of that page, so you can sort of actually track that and make it a lot more visible and easier. And there's more and more sort of like, I guess, environmental sort of modules that are starting to come out from the communities, including ones that are also like being a bit more visual and like properly putting it on the page so people know when they're coming to the page, hey, this is what your visit is doing in terms of like environmental impact. So really just surfacing that visibility. Yeah.
Just expanding on that gentleman's question about where the kind of to focus effort, if you like. How does this compare to, say, all of your endpoints that you're managing, your end user devices, PCs, printers? Is that the right place to be focusing on the software side, or actually should we be focusing as well on those areas, or more on those areas?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. So again, I'll just repeat. The question was, in terms of the focus area, and we mentioned focusing on software, is that the right area to focus compared to some of the physical stuff, like people's actual devices that they're using, and where the impact can be made? I think the answer for me would be, we do want to focus on all of it. The reality is we have more control in terms of our sphere to control the software side of it, and so that's why we tend to put more of our time into that piece, rather than like how much influence and control we have over people constantly buying new phones and getting new technology and that, which we have less of an influence over, but we're trying to just sort of like put the right message out there, if that makes sense. So that's why we tend to focus on there. But like, we would encourage really focusing on all of it where we can, like all of it's important. And the other thing I'll mention is kind of what I was referring to earlier, like the physical side of some of this stuff is the stuff that gets a lot of the headlines in a lot of areas. So a lot of people will be thinking about like my commute to work and using a car and stuff like that, like the physical side of it. That's the stuff that a lot of people can really grasp and think about. But what we would really, why we're pushing the software bit, is the software bit is people don't think about it. People are a little bit, where we've done these talks, like slightly ignorant to the fact that actually using all of these apps, using all of these sort of sites is also impactful. And so to answer your question, yeah, that's where we focus, because that's more of our sphere of control, but we should be really trying to focus on all of it where we can. Again, I don't know if you had anything to know. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really about the kind of perform and educate side. There's a massive issue with storage at the moment in the sector. I'm just interested, when you work with a university, the teams that you ever work with ever involve like students and staff? Because having been at Dundee and not being aware of what you're doing, it's like there are student groups, sustainability societies that don't think their universities are doing anything, and they're kind of frustrated because they don't think fellow students or staff really understand like the impact of digital. So it's really, has any university asked you to do that? Have you ever thought about asking other staff and students to be kind of
Yeah, so that's a really lovely question. So the question there is about when we're sort of doing some of this work in terms of our like end users, how involved they get, and also like staff, how involved they get. I think the short answer to that is staff, yes. Students, no. So in terms of staff, yes, actually, we usually get some quite good engagement with different teams to get them involved. More and more, we're seeing that organizations do actually have their own environmental manager or someone in that sort of guise who's got some sort of like responsibility to sort of like build an environmental strategy. And so getting staff involved, we find we can do quite well and really engage. End users like students, no, actually, we've not, that's not come up actually, it's not been asked, but that's a really good and interesting opportunity space. Did it come up for the Dundee work? No, yeah, so I think that would be something we'd love to do, to really engage them, and I think they'd be a really powerful voice for us to be able to get involved, so we'd love to do that. And I think we are at time as well. So thank you very much again, everyone, really appreciate it, and
Thank you.
enjoy the rest of your day. Appreciate it.